It's tragic, right? Anytime you hear something like this, it doesn't matter. It's youth, elders, young people. You know, when you lose a member in the community, the whole community is affected, right?
Tonight, bodies recovered from the Winnipeg River at Saugeen First Nation.
And we're saying that to the Government of Canada, it's not okay if you ignore it and keep on walking too. You have a duty to help that child.
First Nation children and family advocate readies for yet another hearing into the unequal treatment of First Nations kids.
There are multiple priorities, so it's hard to choose one specifically, but if I can just...
And we sit down with Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Volunteer divers in Manitoba have helped 2 grieving Saugeen First Nations families. This comes after more than a month-long search to find 2 missing snowmobilers. Ashley Branson has more.
While APTN was on the scene on Wednesday, members of a volunteer dive team pulled a male body from the icy waters of the Winnipeg River. The Hatarian Emergency Aquatic Response Team, also known as HART, began the search on Sunday. In November, 2 people on a snowmobile went through the ice while trying to cross the river at Saugeen First Nation. The identity of the remains has not been released. In an email from RCMP Media Relations, they confirm a body was recovered yesterday around 2:30 p.m. by volunteer divers. We do not have a positive identification. Saugeen First Nation Chief Derek Henderson described how he felt about the search.
It's tragic, right? Anytime you hear something like this, it doesn't matter. It's youth, elders, young people. You know, when you lose a member in the community, the whole community is affected, right?
HART located the remains in the murky, fast-moving river using this underwater remote-controlled camera known as a rover.
Down she goes.
Today, the search continued in hopes to finding a second body. In a phone conversation, Henderson says he contacted the family of the missing man and woman to let them know a body was found.
We did a prayer with we had the Catholic minister come here and did a prayer for the body when it was retrieved here.
He adds the discovery comes days after HART located the snowmobile the missing man and woman were riding. HART declined to speak on camera, but confirmed they located the snowmobile on Sunday using their underwater camera.
It's more of a relief, right, because they knew that the body was there, but it's a matter of us retrieving it and then having closure now, right?
RCMP say an autopsy is being scheduled, but a date has not been confirmed. APTN just received a message late this afternoon from Chief Henderson. He says a second body of a woman has been recovered by the volunteer divers. Ashley Branson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Well, it may be a brand new year, but the battle for equality for First Nations kids in Canada has been ongoing for 12 years. And next week, the federal government is back in front of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, defending its progress on implementing Jordan's Principle, a measure that's supposed to ensure First Nations kids in need of care don't fall between federal and provincial cracks. Cindy Blackstock joined us earlier from our Ottawa bureau to talk about what can be expected. Hello, Cindy. Thanks for joining us. So tell us what's on the agenda for the tribunal next week.
Well, one of the areas we have not been able to come to agreement in is that Canada wants to exclude non-status First Nations children from Jordan's Principle who live off reserve. We disagree with that, and we think there needs to be a full hearing about it because the tribunal's order says all First Nations children. So in the meantime, until that hearing can take place, we would like an order that Canada has to at least help those First Nations non-status kids living off reserve who have urgent needs. And what I mean by that, I mean something like a life-threatening situation or something that if the harm is not addressed, that it can't be fixed. Like, for example, a child who's at risk of going into child welfare care, who, if they don't have the service, will go into child welfare care. We want Canada to help those kids pending that hearing, and Canada says no. So that's what we're going to be talking about at the tribunal on January 9th.
Is the argument that these children are, since they're living off reserve, that they would be covered by the provincial government? Is that what Canada's arguing?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to hear what Canada's argument is. I'm not 100% clear on how this makes sense to them, particularly because Canada signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that obligate them to provide services for all kids. And what we're talking about here is just helping kids in the most urgent situation. It's the same thing I'd expect from a citizen. If you or I were walking down the road and we saw a child that was in a life-threatening situation and kept on walking, that wouldn't be okay. And we're saying that to the government of Canada, it's not okay if you ignore it and keep on walking too. You have a duty to help that child. And if you feel that the province should have paid, you can recover the money from them later. But let's help at least these kids who are in life-threatening situations who are First Nations non-status kids off reserve.
I mean, I thought we had settled this 10, 12 years ago, and here we are, fresh new year, 2019, and here we are still fighting with Canada and its responsibility to Indigenous kids. Is it frustrating for you?
It's sad for me because I know at the end of the day, who's really paying the price are the little children and their families themselves. And I've always said about this case, I measure success at the level of children and families, not in announcements, not even in legal rulings. It's about whether or not we're giving those children the best that they deserve. And it's really disappointing to me to see that adults are fighting, governments are opposing First Nations children from having their urgent needs met because of blood quantum, the Indian Act.
Has there been any movement? Like, would you say that there's been an improvement in the last couple of years? Are you hearing more success stories? Like, give us something to cling to, I guess.
Yeah, no, there is definitely room for improvement, or there has been improvement. For example, if we were to turn the clock back even to when the tribunal made the order, and indeed to 2016, Canada was still saying Jordan's principle only applies to children with short-term illnesses and long-term disabilities. That's gone now. Canada does acknowledge that it applies to all First Nations children of diversities, kids who need education help, kids who need health help, kids who need help in child welfare, kids in juvenile justice. All of those services or products for those kids are eligible under Jordan's principle. And so far, over 100,000 of those types of requests have been approved. So that's all good news. But what we're saying at the Caring Society is we don't feel that any level of discrimination against children is okay. And we need to stand up so that these kids get full culturally based equity. And that's our bar. And we would hope that Canada would see that too and not fight us, but join with us in making that happen.
And so how soon do you expect to hear back about a full hearing on this?
Well, the tribunal will hear the interim order next week on January 9th. And then we've got several dates set to hear this matter and other matters going up until March. So I would suspect we'd probably be in a full hearing about this question of all First Nations children sometime around the end of April or May.
Well, let's hope this 2019 is the year that we get this all ironed out, sorted out, and we don't have to be discussing it again in 2020.
That is my prayer, is that we can all have faith that the days of First Nations children getting less are over with, because to me, every one of those kids is sacred and every one of those kids is worth the money.
Thanks for fighting the fight, Cindy. It's good to talk to you again, as always.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We need to take a quick break, but stay tuned. But first, here's tomorrow's weather forecast where you live and a look at what's coming up on Nation to Nation after the news.
What's coming up on Nation to Nation? Our political panel of MPs takes a look ahead at some important laws expected in the new year. A month ago, the Prime Minister promised to table legislation on child welfare reform and on an Indigenous Languages Act. But time is running out to have them tabled and passed before the next election. And the MPs debate the Liberal government's legislation to ban tanker traffic on BC's north coast. Some Indigenous groups support it, while others want the economic benefits of a proposed pipeline. That's coming up right after the national news.
Over on the East Coast, we've got -6 and sunny in St. John's, 0 and rain in Halifax, -19 and snow in Inukjuak, Kuujjuaq's -20 and snow. 0s for Norda, Val-d'Or, and Quebec City. 2s for North Bay and Ottawa with some snowy sleet there. -7 in snow in Big Trout Lake 1 and mostly sunny in Thunder Bay. -15 in snow in Churchill, -8s for God's Lake and Norway House. -1s for Gimli and Winnipeg, mostly sunny skies. 3 in Brandon, -1 in Dauphin and mostly sunny. +5 in Swift Current. 4s for Regina and Estevan, sunshine down south. -15 and snow in Uranium City. -14 and snow in Stony Rapids. -7 and mostly sunny in La Ronge. Welcome back. A new year is upon us, and 2018 was a year of note for Indigenous services. Minister Jane Philpott has been at its helm for an entire year now. APTN Nation to Nation host producer Todd Lamrand interviewed Minister Philpott about the past year and what's in store for 2019.
Well, Minister Philpott, welcome to APTN National News.
Thanks for having me.
We'll start off with the year has ended kind of on a tragic note, especially in Thunder Bay with now we know as the murder of Braden Jacob. A while ago you said significant investments had been made in his community in a media scrum. But why did this young man still have to go to Thunder Bay all by himself?
Well, I want to also acknowledge that it's been a very difficult couple of weeks for the Thunder Bay community and Anishinaabe Nation, and of course Webekwe specifically. In terms of the specific details of why this young man had to go for his counseling or treatment in Thunder Bay, I'm not familiar with the details of the case. The reality is, as I said, yes, we've made very large investments in mental wellness and Jordan's Principle, the Choose Life program, etc. Sadly, that doesn't actually address the deep roots of why someone like this would have experienced such a tragedy. It's a terrible story. It speaks to the vulnerability of Indigenous youth in the cities of this country, and it speaks to how we have to do so much better to address all of the root causes of why he ended up in that circumstance.
Does an escort need to be funded to start going with young people who go to Thunder Bay?
Well, as you know, we do support having someone to accompany people when they travel for health reasons on a case-by-case basis in some cases, but we know that there is funding there for those. As I say, I don't know the specific details of who may or may not have wanted to travel with him. This is a really, really important case, though, because of course we hope that it is going to be properly investigated so that we will get the right answers that we need to get to the root causes of how this happened and to try to make sure that this never happens again. It's happened far too many times in this community. And as I say, I think the more that we understand of what took place, the more that we can make sure that we are getting those supports, making sure that young people in Thunder Bay and other cities across the country are safe, protected, not discriminated against, and not targeted.
I'm going to move on to housing. I know you said on many times that lack of quality housing underlies a lot of health problems in particular. I know you've announced many projects over the past year, for example, over $1 million for 6 units in the Beausoleil First Nation here in Ontario, for example. But couldn't more housing be built for that amount of money?
Well, we have made significant progress in housing. I believe at last count we're at about 15,000 homes that have been built or had major renovations on reserve. We know there's still a very large gap there. We have made significant investments in housing, not only for First Nations on reserve, but also large investments in housing for Inuit and for the Métis Nation as well. There is much more to do to address the gap, not just for housing, but for other infrastructure, and we're investing in schools and health centers and roads, as well as making sure that we do better in the area of operations and maintenance. I think we have made important progress, and I hear across the country of what's happened, and then that literally hundreds of communities across the country that have built new houses over the last 3 years. But there's more work to be done. We acknowledge that, and we're working with the Assembly of First Nations and other national Indigenous organizations to find out how we can do better and faster.
What about the provinces? I know the province of BC has made a significant investment on their own for an Indigenous housing strategy. What has the federal government done, I guess, about getting other provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, for example, to do the same kind of thing? Well,
you're absolutely right that it is something that we have to work on collaboratively with provinces and territories, specifically for urban housing needs. And I really do salute the work of British Columbia, that they have taken some of the funding that came not from my department but from Infrastructure Canada. We made very large investments as a federal government for infrastructure in every single province and territory. We hope that provinces and territories will allocate a portion of that to a specific urban Indigenous housing strategy in a similar fashion to what British Columbia has done. We are continuing to have those conversations, as is my counterpart, the Minister of Infrastructure, to make sure that a healthy portion of infrastructure investments recognizes the needs of Indigenous peoples, and including in remote areas.
Have you or your counterpart actually sat down with the premier of those provinces I mentioned and really asked them to do the same thing as BC?
Well, we do meet with our counterparts on a regular basis. I know the Minister of Infrastructure meets with his counterparts and talks specifically about these things. I use every opportunity I have when I'm with ministers from the provinces and territories to talk about how we can work together better. We're seeing some good examples of that in a number of places. Of course, the really fantastic example we're also proud of is Wataynikaneyap Power in Northern Ontario, that is very soon going to bring clean hydroelectric power to Pikangikum, and then after that to another 16 First Nations in the north. Projects like that have to be encouraged, and we hope that more provinces will step up.
Water, I know that I believe you're more than halfway to your goal of getting rid of water advisories by 2021, I believe is the date. These are public systems, of course. What about water quality on First Nation where there's a lot of private systems? Maybe they draw water from their wells. I know there are especially the Iroquois nations here in this area, do have a lot of private systems.
Well, thanks for raising the issue. We have made progress that we're pleased about in working in collaboration with First Nations leadership. We've now seen the lifting of 76 long-term drinking water advisories for public systems on reserve and 65 more to go. That includes, of course, health clinics, community centers, schools, etc. All of the water that serves public systems that is then distributed out to homes from there. There are other drinking water advisories, for instance, on when we talk about private systems, we're talking about things like a gas station perhaps, or a convenience store that might be located on reserve, and we do know that they have boil water advisories that we hope that they will address as well. The issue around making sure it gets out to every home is a challenge that we are also addressing. We made a big investment this year at Six Nations, for example, who didn't necessarily have an issue with the actual system, but it was not distributed out to the community. We're doing similar kind of work with the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte and have supported them in a number of water projects. So you're right, there's more to do than just lifting the advisory on those systems. That's a big important step in the right direction. To take it from there and make sure it actually gets distributed well is work that we are also proceeding with.
Now, I'm not sure if this comes under Indigenous services, but I know a lot of Indigenous people would like to know when will it be easier to get a new status card?
Well, there is work being done in that particular area, and we're doing service improvement in a number of areas. I'd be happy to provide folks with more details on that as those new initiatives become available. But for instance, in our Winnipeg office, where we often hear of a lot of requests, there's significant process improvements that are underway, and that is definitely something that we are paying attention to.
Shouldn't there be a day, I guess, when you could go to Service Canada and get it as quickly as you get a driver's license, for example?
Well, I would like to see that it would be even easier than that, and we are certainly working on mechanisms. For example, there are new technologies that are becoming available so that you don't have to, that you can actually use your phone to be able to take the photograph that's required and be able to upload that. So there is work being done to improve it, and I think we've made some progress so far, but it's definitely an area where there's more to come.
So water, health, housing, child welfare, we're going into an election year, of course, there's not much time left. So what is the top priority for your department as we head to next October?
There are multiple priorities, so it's hard to choose one specifically, but if I can just point to, you talked about child welfare, and you may know that we've recently announced that we will be going forward to table legislation that addresses issues around child and family services for Indigenous children. This is a really important piece of work. This is work that we have co-developed in collaboration with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and it is going to lay a mark in time to say very loudly and clearly to everyone, this has got to change. No more taking children away from their families, no more scooping. We need to find ways to support families, to prevent the apprehension of children, and to get children back home.
Of course, will it get passed by next October? I guess is the big question. I mean, I've seen legislation sail through in a matter of months, and then something like Bill C-21, which just got royal assent, the one introduced by the Public Safety Minister, Mr. Goodell, took 2 years. So I guess, what's the difference? Like, what do you have to get to ensure that this piece of legislation gets through?
Well, I am determined to do everything within my power to be able to move this along. Where I feel confident is the fact that this is a piece of legislation that has been co-developed. We have had consensus across the country in terms of support from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis about why this is important and what needs to be in the legislation. I've heard good, positive signals from both the Conservatives and the New Democratic Party that, of course, they support keeping families together. And the senators are really, really interested in this bill. I've met with Senator Sinclair and a whole range of Indigenous senators who are quite enthusiastic about this. I really hope that it will move through quickly.
Well, we'll have to see. Again, Minister Philpott, once again, thank you for dropping by and doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Back to you in Winnipeg.
It's time for us to take another quick break, and here's the rest of tomorrow's weather forecast. To northern Alberta, -12 in high level and sunny skies, -13 in snow in Fort Chip, -1 in snow in Edmonton, +6 and sunny in Calgary, +8 and sunny in Lethbridge. 9s for Campbell River and Vancouver, rainy there. Tofino and Victoria, also rainy and cloudy. -15 in sunshine in Dease Lake, -11 and it's mostly sunny in Fort Wilson, -22 in Old Crow. Welcome back. A chance encounter is believed to be the reason a man is alive tonight. Helga Hamilton was taking her dog Max for a walk at Garbage Hill, a popular walking spot in Winnipeg, a few nights ago. And while the evening started out in an ordinary way, it ended up with a story of survival. Hamilton walks Max at the park when she's in Winnipeg, and Max usually sticks to the same path, but for some reason decided to go off the trail. After a few minutes, she heard him barking and says that she was trying to call him back, but he wouldn't come. When she followed him, she saw him beside a young man who was laying lifeless in the snow.
We were able to get him. He's up, he's all right. Max also got to meet him as well. So he's very thankful. He's very happy that Max, for whatever reason, went the way he did and saved his life.
Hamilton calls it divine intervention. She's originally from Cross Lake, but just happened to be in Winnipeg visiting. Good dog. Well, that's all the time we have for your news tonight. You can always find more on our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Melissa Ridgen, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great night and stay tuned for Nation to Nation right now.
Tonight on Nation to Nation. Last month, the Prime Minister announced two important laws will be tabled this month: an Indigenous Languages Act and Indigenous Control of Child and Family Services.
This is all systems go. These are two extremely important pieces of legislation.
But lawmakers only have 14 weeks of work left before the next federal election campaign begins.
And then, what they're going to do is they're going to maybe table it in late January, early February. And then they're going to say, oh, well, we don't have time for you to do the diligence that you should do it.
The NDP supports an Indigenous Languages Act, but where's the promise of sustained funding?
Governments, both Liberals and Conservatives, have thrown piecemeal funding, and it's no wonder that it's such a struggle to provide Indigenous language supports and education.
I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation to Nation. At last month's AFN Chiefs Assembly, the Prime Minister made a bold promise that an overhaul of Child and Family Services and an Indigenous Languages Act would be tabled and passed before the next election. Because if they aren't, they die on the order paper, and it's back to square one, provided the Liberals are re-elected. And joining me now is the Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, welcome. The Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs for the Conservative Party, Cathy McLeod, and the NDP MP from Northern Manitoba, Nikki Ashton. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller, I'll start with you. Prime Minister at the AFN Special Assembly a few weeks ago promised to table legislation in January on child welfare and Indigenous Languages Act. How realistic is it that we're going to get these two major pieces of legislation passed before the next election?
Well, this is also